Thank you all for coming out this evening. I've been to Atlanta many times over the years for one thing and another, but I've never been to Decatur, and I'm happy to rectify that omission in my education. We got here a little early, and so we went and looked at the farmers market that you've got here, which is really pretty spectacular. I think you should work hard to keep that a secret. Well, 9 years ago, as Joe mentioned, I started a project which I call the Liberation Trilogy, and it was intended to tell the tale of the American Army's role in the liberation of Europe in World War II, and I can now report that I am 2/3 of the way done. The first volume, An Army at Dawn, which was published in 2002, recounts how American and British forces invaded Morocco and Algeria in November of 1942, fighting first the French, and then in a 7-month campaign full of sorrow and error and valor, fighting the Germans and the Italians in Tunisia to complete the occupation of North Africa in May of 1943. This second volume, The Day of Battle, which is just out in paperback this week, picks up where Volume 1 ends, and it recounts the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and carries us into the campaign in Italy proper, to Salerno, Anzio, Cassino, the Rapido River, through the fall of Rome on June 4th, 1944, with many of the same fabulous characters from Volume 1, Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery, Omar Bradley, people you've heard about, and many fabulous new ones, and a number who have been lost to history or have slipped into obscurity and ought not to. And then Volume 3, no doubt to be published in my dotage, will pick up with the invasion of Normandy and carry us through the end of the war in Europe. From the beginning of my work on this, it has been my presumption that you cannot understand what happened at Normandy and in that final decisive year of the war in Europe without understanding what came before. That army, those soldiers, those commanders who land on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, did not leap fully armed from the ether. They had a history. They had a pedigree, individually and collectively. They had a history of sorrow and error and valor. And before we talk a bit about the Italian portion of that pedigree, and before we get to your questions and your comments, let me offer a few observations regarding writing about World War II in the 21st century. First, it's the greatest story of the 20th century and should always be treated as such. Storytelling is too important to leave to the novelists and the playwrights. Remember E.M. Forster's definition. If I say to you, the king died and then the queen died, that's a sequence of events. But if I say to you, the king died and the queen died of heartbreak, that's a story. Storytelling taps perhaps the most ancient of art forms, even more ancient than PhD dissertation writing. And for those of us foolish enough to take it up on an epic scale, Robert Fagles has some useful advice applicable to all narrative writing. In discussing his recent translation of the Aeneid, Fagles says, you can't let it sag. Cadence is everything, and that takes a lot of lung, a lot of nerve, and a lot of luck. Well, it also takes a lot of archival spade work to do it well. William Hazlitt, the great English literary critic, once said that most books are made up of other books, chopped up and reconstituted. Well, that may be true of most good books, but it's not true of most great books or those with overarching ambitions. There must be a thrust toward originality in voice and in material. Well, those of us working in the World War II vineyard have a fine opportunity. One scholar has estimated that the entire archive of World War II material, all the records and the diaries and all the rest of it put together, weighs 14,000 tons. Well, I can't vouch for his methodology, but that seems about right to me. You know, Boris Pasternak, the great Russian novelist, told us that life is always deep in details, and the details live in that archive. Now, in sifting through those 14,000 tons, it's good to remember as one of my personal role models told us, Shelby Foote, many of you are familiar with him, the Civil War historian. He said, "A fact is not a truth until you love it." Well, we're looking for facts to love, to tease coherence and intimacy from the past, to find those fine brushstrokes that bring the dead to life. John Updike, who's our greatest living man of letters now, wrote that World War II was the 20th century's central myth. He called it a vast imagining of a primal time when good and evil contended for the planet, a tale of Troy whose angles are infinite and whose central figures never fail to amaze us with their size, their theatricality, their sweep. And toward that end, I use a fragment from the Aeneid as the epigraph to the day of battle, and it goes like this. Muses, launch your song. What kings were fired for war? What armies at their orders thronged the plain? What heroes sprang into bloom? What weapons blazed even in those days long ago in Italy's life-giving land? So how did we end up in Italy's life-giving land? Why were we in Italy? Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, had in fact been decided 7 months before the fact during the conference convened at Casablanca in Morocco in January of 1943 between Prime Minister Churchill, President Roosevelt, and their military brain trusts. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean. It's only about 100 miles north of the African shoreline. And seizing the island would further safeguard Mediterranean shipping through the Suez Canal. At this point, when they make this decision, it's clear that we're going to win in North Africa, although there's going to be a lot of pain in heaven getting there. And seizing Sicily would also provide air bases for bombing mainland Italy and for the German Reich. But what to do beyond Sicily is bitterly disputed. The British advocate carrying the war straight into mainland Italy, largely to knock Italy out of the Axis alliance. Churchill insists, as he puts it, this will cause a chill of loneliness over the German people and might be the beginning of their doom. The Americans are skeptical. They suspect that Britain's fixation on the Mediterranean, and we're in North Africa because Britain has argued successfully to put us there, that this reflects imperial ambitions. The war will be won, the Americans insist, in Central Europe, and the shortest, surest way to the heart of Central Europe is to cross the English Channel and drive for Berlin. The British legitimately argue that the Soviet Union, which is shouldering the heaviest combat burden of the Allies, will hardly countenance the Western Allies sitting on their hands for nearly a year between the conquest of Sicily, the conquest of Sicily is complete in August of 43, and the cross-channel invasion into France, the Normandy invasion as it became, which of course occurred in June of 44. The U.S. Army at this point, when they're arguing about this, is 6 million soldiers strong. It's growing to 8 million. There are 343,000 lieutenants alone in the U.S. Army. They have to do something. Well, the British also make extravagant claims to overcome this Yankee skepticism. They over-egg the pudding, as one critic put it. They assert that Germany was unlikely to fight hard for mainland Italy, that the Allied commitment in Italy would be modest and require no substantial occupation, and that a successful fight in the Mediterranean could end the war in 1944. None of these prophecies proved accurate. What emerges, as is so often the case in coalition warfare, we see it in our day, is a compromise forged after harsh debate. The cross-channel attack will be launched, as we know, in the late spring of 1944. But until then, General Eisenhower, the Allied commander-in-chief in the Mediterranean, is told to come up with a plan for operations after the Sicilian campaign ends that is, quote, best calculated to eliminate Italy from the war and to contain the maximum number of German forces. These are Eisenhower's marching orders. The his political bosses say, we can't figure this out, you figure it out, you come up with a plan. Plan calculated to eliminate Italy from the war and to contain the maximum number of German forces. Okay, the campaign in Sicily goes pretty well. The island falls in 6 weeks, although most of the 4 German divisions fighting there get away. It's one of the great tragedies of the war. They get away, and we fight them over and over again in Italy. But in a muscular mood of confidence, the decision is made by Eisenhower and affirmed by his uppers and betters to carry the war to the Italian mainland. And these invasions occur in September 1943, with the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery landing in the toe of the boot of Italy. It's only 2 miles from Sicily. And the main Anglo-American 5th Army under the American Lieutenant General Mark Clark landing at Salerno, just south of Naples. That's in September 43. The Italians capitulate. Before the first soldier sets foot on the beach at Salerno, they're out of the war. But the Germans end up fighting to the death, up the length of the Italian boot in a campaign that lasts 608 days, costs 312,000 Allied casualties, and remains controversial to this day. Now, in telling that story comprehensively, it's important to wrestle with various big questions. Why did they do this and not that? Why did they go left and not right? Did the campaign in Italy make any sense? Yet even in acknowledging and addressing these vital disputed historical points, as a writer, you'd like them not to engulf the story. It seems to me the best way to do this is through character. Characters not only ought to be the spine of the narrative, but they can serve as a guide through the serpentine journey that we're taking through these big questions. They have to breathe. They must walk and talk. They must engage us intellectually and emotionally, because the narrative writer's true calling is to bring them back from the dead. Here's an example of someone I'd like to bring back from the dead, someone who makes his first appearance in Volume 1 of this trilogy, An Army at Dawn. His name is Lucian K. Truscott, Jr. And when we've first seen him in Volume 1, he's a brigadier general in November 1942. The author's task requires not only bringing characters to life, but to keep them alive. And in my case, it requires having them pirouette from one volume to the next and then to the next, as if they're dancing between ice flows. We have to see them grow, evolve, devolve, change. A reappearance in Volume 2 cannot simply replicate the character in Volume 1. Not only is that insufficient from a narrative standpoint, it's historically phony because he ain't the same guy. War changes them. War changes all of them. Here's Truscott from Chapter 2 of Volume 2, The Day of Battle. He's now a Major General, a 2-star. He commands the 3rd Infantry Division, which just got back from Iraq not long ago. Truscott is preparing to land his invasion force at Licata in Sicily on July 10, 1943, the day of the invasion. And as we've already learned, before joining the cavalry as a young man, Lucian Truscott had taught school for 6 years, mostly in one-room schoolhouses in Oklahoma. Not your usual preparation to become an Army general. The schoolmaster never left him. "You use the passive voice too damn much," he once chided a younger officer, and he wrote long, searching critiques of subordinate performance. Even in combat, he cherished cut flowers on his desk and ontological inquiries. A staff meeting might begin with Truscott asking the division chaplain, "What is sin?" His kit bag included War and Peace, Webster's High School Dictionary, and perhaps a liquor bottle. Some subordinates thought he drank too much. A stern disciplinarian, he had imposed 50-year sentences on soldiers who maimed themselves in North Africa to avoid combat. Truscott had learned much in Morocco about what he called the loneliness of the battlefield and the need for physical vigor. Each 3rd Division battalion was required to master the Truscott trot by marching 5 miles in the first hour and 4 miles an hour thereafter, as long as necessary. Nothing revealed more of him than his letters home to Sarah Randolph Truscott, which began invariably, "Beloved wife." Aboard the USS Biscayne off Sicily on July 7th, he had written to Sarah, "Do you remember how you used to get after me for working so hard and how I answered that I had to be ready, prepare myself for any responsibility that came to me? I'm only sorry that my limitations were such that I could not accomplish more because responsibilities are certainly falling on me. Your calm confidence in me is always with me, and when doubt falls upon me, as it must on all, that thought soon restores that confidence. I can do only the best I can." What is the point? It's said that history deals with the teasing gap separating a lived event from its subsequent narration. Rarely is that gap more exasperating than writing about military events. Walt Whitman told us the real war will never get in the books. The implication is that war on some level is unknowable, ineffable, too chaotic, too horrible to convey with mere words. This is a subset of the assertion that history is something that never happened, written by a man who wasn't there. The talented journalist Martha Gellhorn, who was in Italy in that winter of 43-44, said simply, "War was always worse than I knew how to say." But that's our task, whether you're writing about the grandest of grand strategy or about life for Joe and Willie in a foxhole, to close the gap, to find the words that Gellhorn couldn't, to put the lie to Walt Whitman and ensure that the real war does get in the books. Are storytelling and history incompatible? Norman Maclean, the elegant writer of Young Men and Fire and A River Runs Through It, thought they were incompatible. Maclean wrote, "If a storyteller thinks enough of storytelling to regard it as a calling, unlike a historian, he cannot turn from the sufferings of his characters. A storyteller, unlike a historian, must follow compassion wherever it leads him. He must be able to accompany his characters even into smoke and fear and bear witness to what they thought and felt." I adore Norman Maclean, but I think he's wrong here. I believe the narrative historian is trying to empower the reader's imagination precisely in order to follow our characters into smoke and fear. Here's an example from Italy. In January 1944, 2 regiments from the 36th Division, formerly the Texas National Guard, launched a sequence of frontal attacks across the Rapido River near Cassino in central Italy. It was defended by the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, one of those that got away in Sicily. The American attack failed with more than 2,000 casualties in one of the worst drubbings the Americans took in the entire war. Here's the end of my account. Some hours after the final shots faded on the Rapido, a captured American private who had been released to serve as a courier stumbled into the 141st Infantry Command Post carrying a written message for Den Englischen Kommandeur. The Germans didn't even know they were fighting the Americans. They thought it was the English. The Panzer Grenadiers proposed a 3-hour ceasefire to search for the living and retrieve the dead. GIs fashioned Red Cross flags from towels and iodine, and even before the appointed hour paddled across to both regimental bridgeheads. They found a few survivors, including Private Arthur E. Stark, known as Styx, who had carried a battalion switchboard across the river for the 143rd Infantry before being hit by shell fragments. For 3 days, he lay exposed to January weather. "Did you have a big Christmas? You should have seen mine," he had written his 11-year-old sister, Carol, in early January. "The little boys and girls over here didn't have much Christmas." Styx lingered for 2 days after his rescue, then passed over. Other cases ended better. A forward observer with half his face blown away appeared to be dead, but a medic noticed the lack of rigor mortis. Surgeons would reconstruct his visage from a photograph mailed by his family. For 3 hours, they gathered the dead, reaping what had been sown. Wehrmacht medics worked side by side with the Americans, making small talk and offering tactical critiques of the attack. German photographers wandered the battlefield snapping pictures. An American reporter studied the looming rock face of Monte Cassino with its omniscient white monastery. Sooner or later, he said, somebody's going to have to blow that place all to hell. The short piece ended. Dusk rolled over the bottoms. The mists reconvened. A final clutch of medics emerged carrying a long pole with a white truce flag that caught the dying light. More than 100 bodies had been retrieved, but hundreds more remained and would remain for months, carrion for the ravenous dogs that roamed these fens. Here the dreamless dead would lie, leached to bone by the passing seasons, and waiting, as all the dead would wait, for doomsday's horn. The historian Will Durant once calculated that in all of human history, there have only been 29 years in which there was not a war in progress somewhere. And sadly, not one of those 29 years is unfolded in the lifetime of anyone in this room, or in this state, or on this planet. War is our lot. It's where we live. It shapes our culture, our history, and our souls, individually and collectively. It shapes us to the extent that J. Glenn Gray, who was one of those very erudite World War II veterans, suggested that Homo sapiens should perhaps be renamed Homo furens, man the fighter. War is also my theme for 5 books now, because it's a lens for looking at us, for understanding some part of who we are, even if it requires looking through a glass darkly. Susan Sontag asked some years ago, is there an antidote to the perennial seductiveness of war? It seems to me the best answer to that is write as truly as you can. I consider each of those 5 books to be an anti-war book. Samuel Eliot Morison, the great naval historian, said we ought to read history because it will help us to behave better. Now this from a guy, when working at his desk one day, was interrupted by a barking dog and went out and shot it. Well, Morison's prescription about history, not about barking dogs, seems too brazenly didactic to me. But Walter McDougall, the distinguished writer and historian at Penn, Vietnam veteran, describes how history provides us with what he calls a mental trellis needed to place ourselves in time and space. He says it's the only academic subject that inspires humility, much as theology once did. I mentioned that the Italian campaign has remained controversial for more than 60 years. 750,000 American soldiers fought in Italy. They suffered, just the Americans, 120,000 battle casualties, including 23,000 killed in action. The fact that they accomplished the 2 goals required of them by Washington and London, knocking Italy out of the war and engaging a substantial number of German divisions to prevent reinforcement of what became the Normandy front, has not prevented many strategists from questioning whether those goals were sensible. Even in 1944, a 2-word headline in Time magazine asked, "Great stupidity?" Yet all criticism of the Italian strategy, and it continues to this day, bumps against an inconvenient rebuttal. If not Italy, where? No ocean-going fleet existed to move 500,000 men from Africa to England or anywhere else, nor could British ports, rails, and other facilities, already overwhelmed by the American horde staging for Normandy, handle such a force, nor, as Prime Minister Churchill recognized, would Moscow have tolerated an idling of American armies, of Allied armies, during the 10 months between the conquest of Sicily and the Normandy invasion. Samuel Morison said the Italian campaign was fought because it had to be fought. Well, that kind of historical tautology is suspect, and opportunism lacks the panache of grand strategy. But it's also important to remember that the American commander-in-chief had grown comfortable with a campaign that in Italy, more than any other theater, resembled the grinding inelegance of World War I. A week after the invasion of Sicily, Franklin Roosevelt said, "Our war of attrition is doing its work," and he never renounced that strategy. Well, I'll close and then we'll open it up and make this a conversation. I'll close where the day of battle closes, perhaps spoiling the ending, but saving $15 for anyone inclined to buy the thing. Rome has fallen on June 4th, 1944, after intense fighting to get past German defenses in the Colli Laziali, the Alban Hills, between Anzio and Rome. The capture of Rome, of course, is overshadowed 2 days later by the Normandy invasion. We may move on to Western Europe, but many thousands of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers really, were consigned to remain in Italy for the duration of the war until May of 1945. Well, here they are on June 6, 1944, in Rome. Howitzers barked wheel to wheel in the Villa Borghese gardens above the Via Veneto. Wreathed in smoke, the guns banged away at the retreating enemy north of the Tiber. Soldiers crowded around platoon radios with heads cocked and mouths agape, listening to the latest news from France and laying bets on when the war would end. No one put down a date past Thanksgiving, a soldier in the 36th Division recalled. I often wondered what happened to that money. Weary sergeants ordered them to fall in and move out. Come on, man, come on, Ernie Harmon, commander of the 1st Armored Division, urged a Sherman tank commander. There are places to go. A tank crewman told his diary, drove through Rome to the other side of the Tiber River. People threw flowers at us, stopped and had coffee. The 88th Division Vanguard radioed a 2-word message, beyond Rome. Olive drab columns streamed across the river and past the cylindrical Castle Sant'Angelo, tomb of the warrior Emperor Hadrian. On the roof stood the bronze statue of St. Michael, the Archangel, patron of soldiers, sheathing his sword. GIs smelling of Chianti and Chesterfields jammed the deuce-and-a-half trucks or straddled the towed artillery tubes, souvenir lithographs and fascist postage stamps tucked into their packs. Then up they climbed along the dark ridge of the Janiculum, where the ancients once kept a shrine to two-faced Janus, the god of beginnings, and where augurs had studied their auspices. From the hill crest on this cloudless day, Rome unfurled below in a tapestry of reds, browns, and yellows. Beyond the park where Cleopatra once lived in Caesar's villa stood the bell towers and the spires, the cupolas and the domes. On the southern horizon lay the faint blue smudge of the Colli Laziali. North they rolled, on the high ground beneath cypresses and umbrella pines, past Roman gardeners working the flower beds of gray marl and yellow sea sand. North they rolled, and the scent of roses lingered in their wake. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be in your town this evening. Thanks for coming out, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Sure, absolutely. Sir.
Yes, sir. First of all, outstanding speech with much passion.
Thank you.
George Patton, what's your opinion of him? We've all seen the movie slapping the soldier, shooting his pistol at the German French, and so forth. What is your opinion about this?
What's my opinion of George Patton as a strategist and as a commanding or demanding general? Let's say both. Well, as a writer, I love him. You couldn't invent him. If you've seen the movie Patton with George C. Scott, that is quite true to life. The main difference is that unlike George C. Scott's rolling, deep voice, Patton had a very high, squeaky voice, which was very at odds with his commanding presence. He was 6'2", he weighed almost 200 pounds. He filled a room when he came into it, and then he had this very odd voice. He disgraces himself in Sicily. He commits 2 unpardonable sins for which no commander should ever be forgiven, and they're the same sin. He slaps 2 soldiers in a fit of uncontrollable personal rage. It's not just one. If you've seen the movie, You know there's a scene where he goes into a hospital. It's the first Sunday in August 1943. The campaign in Sicily is about to come to an end in 2 weeks. He is very emotionally moved by the wounded soldiers that he sees there, and he sees a young soldier. His name is Kuhl, K-U-H-L, who's from the 1st Division, and Patton believes that he's malingering. Turns out Private Kuhl had a fever of 102. He had malaria. He had dysentery. He had fought valiantly to that point. Patton loses control of himself, slaps the man physically, shrieks at him within earshot of everyone at the hospital, accuses him of cowardice. It happens again a week later, exactly under the same circumstances. Another soldier who is believed by Patton to be malingering, and this time he pulls his pistol out and makes gestures as if he's going to shoot the man. You don't want your generals acting that way. I don't care whether you're talking about Dave Petraeus or George Patton. I've spent a lot of time with Dave Petraeus, including when he was commander of the 101st in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I can tell you that that sort of behavior would not be tolerated for an instant in the Army today. George Patton would have been dismissed. Now, why didn't it happen? And then we'll talk about his redeeming features too. But it's important to, I think, see that this is a man who is not really in control of himself at times. He's got demons, and the demons are with him, really, to the end of his life, when he's killed in a car wreck, as many of you know, at the end of 1945. The reason that his job was not, that he wasn't cashiered, reporters in Sicily knew about this instantly because the doctors, nurses at the hospitals were so irate, they told them everything. And the word immediately got back to Eisenhower, whose headquarters were still in Algiers at the time. And so Eisenhower had a pretty clear picture of what had happened. The reporters agreed not to report it. And there were about 50 of them who knew about it in the Mediterranean. And they did it not because they had any affection for Patton, which they did not, but because they had an affection and respect for Eisenhower, who did not overtly ask them to sit on this story, but he made it clear that this was his best combat commander. He didn't have a surplus of guys who could fight and wanted to fight and loved to fight, and that to dismiss Patton would be a real hardship for him. And so the story ultimately broke not in August of 43 in the Mediterranean, but in November of 43, months later in Washington, where Drew Pearson, the muckraking columnist, had got wind of it and published an account that was more or less accurate at the time. And then all hell broke loose for a while, and the decision was ultimately made by Roosevelt that Patton would be retained. He would be given command of an army, Third Army, in the invasion of Normandy, and so he survived the war to go on to do pretty great things in France, actually. Now, okay, that's the long version of some of his faults. There are others. We could make it much longer. The truth is, if you look at his assets, and he shows them in France in August and September of 1944, this is a man who Stonewall Jackson would recognize instantly. This is a man born to fight. This is a man born to destroy the enemy, to close with and destroy the enemy. That's what it's about, being a combat general. It's an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people, but Patton had it in his blood. And it was important, I think, for us to have as many of those kind of generals as we could. He had an uncanny knack for intuiting what his enemy was going to do. For example, I'll give you one example and we'll move on. When the invasion was about to occur at Salerno, this is where Mark Clark is taking the Anglo-American Fifth Army and invading mainland Italy. It was September 9th, 1943. Eisenhower, at this point, this was a month after the slapping incidents, Eisenhower asked Patton to look at the invasion plan at Salerno. The plan was called Avalanche. And to give him, Eisenhower, his view of it. Patton looked at the plan, looked at the map, said the Germans will counterattack right here, right down the Someto River, in an effort to try to divide the British, who are landing in the north, from the Americans who are landing in the south. Eisenhower said, thank you very much. didn't really do anything with this advice, this prescient advice. That's exactly what the Germans did. And they almost threw Clark and his army back into the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was very, very close. So Patton had the ability to intuit what the enemy was going to do. And he was able to get ahead of their decision cycle in a way that is, it's a natural gift. So, you know, I love him as a writer. I wouldn't want him as a father-in-law. We will see a lot of him in Volume 3, including when he does try to rescue his son-in-law, John Waters, who's captured in North Africa in Volume 1 of this trilogy. The capture of John Waters is described, and he's in a German prison camp in Hammelburg, and Patton, in the spring of 1945, sends a rescue mission, a stupid, foolish rescue mission, gets a lot of soldiers killed in order to try to rescue his son-in-law. So it's long-winded, but he's a wonderful character. Sir? Mark Clark. Yeah, what do I think of Mark Clark? Well, Mark Clark is very difficult to love. Mark W. Clark, the main American commander in the Italian theater right to the end of the war, really. West Point class of 1917. He's 2 years behind Eisenhower. His class of 1915, they've become friends. They're in the same company at West Point. They've remained friends during that long interwar period. Eisenhower's a major for 16 years. Those of you who have been in the military, you know being a major for 16 years, that's torture. And they have helped each other in their careers. As the war is drawing closer, and once we're in the war, they're helping each other. They have a high regard for one another. Eisenhower says that Clark is the best trainer of soldiers we've got in the Army. I think that's true. He was absolutely an extraordinary trainer, and he was an exceptionally fine staff officer. Clark, at one point, is working for Eisenhower in the summer of 1942 in London. It's before we've decided to go to North Africa, and you can see in the daily notes that he sends Eisenhower, he's got a big brain like Eisenhower does. He's extremely articulate, both in writing and orally, as Eisenhower is. Eisenhower is astonishingly articulate, contrary to our image of him as this mumble-mouthed president. Churchill at one point says to the chief of the Imperial General Staff, "I'm not sure I trust a general who is that glib." He's talking about Eisenhower. And Clark is the same way. So Clark has a lot of attributes. His biggest flaw is that he has an unquenchable thirst for personal aggrandizement. He keeps on his staff at Fifth Army a public relations staff of 50 people. Every press release that comes out of Fifth Army is to refer not to the Anglo-American Fifth Army or the U.S. Army's Fifth Army. It's Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark's Fifth Army. He's like that. And he's like that to the point that the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, George C. Marshall, who can't stand that kind of behavior, is completely antithetical to his innermost beliefs about selfless service. He twice personally rebukes Clark. And Eisenhower separately counsels and chastises him for this. He can't help himself. There's some native insecurity where he has just got to see his name in headlines. He's got to feel that accolades are showering on him. It's a major flaw. When we come to the heart of the Italian campaign, he's pretty good. He's pretty good, not least because it's not every guy who can take 23,000 American deaths on his shoulders. This is not an easy thing. Having been around Dave Petraeus, I can tell you that 4,160 American deaths really eats at him. Well, 23,000 is a lot more than that. And Clark can take it. He can take those 312,000 Allied casualties. He's very attentive to logistics, which is really important, fighting in the Apennine Mountains in the winter. He's actually quite caring about the welfare of his soldiers. He spends a lot of time setting up welfare centers and so on to try to get them back out of the cold and the mud and so on. He's personally brave, contrary to the soldier scuttlebutt that's going around. He's very nearly killed on a couple of occasions in Italy because he is, as he frequently is, too close to the front for ultimately a four-star general. Again, you can't make him up. He's physically imposing in a different way from Patton. He's 6'3". He's very rangy. He's got a big wingspan. He has this great beak of a nose. Churchill calls him the American eagle. And so he's half Jewish, incidentally. And he converts to Episcopalianism when he's a cadet at West Point because that is at that time, perceived to be the proper religion for wannabe generals. His mother's father was an immigrant from Romania. At any rate, his size and this raptor face that he's got makes him seem as though he's looking down his nose at people, because he usually is. I find him to be a tormented, intriguing character. I read from one of Lucian Truscott's letters to his wife. I've spent a lot of time looking at Mark Clark's letters to his wife, Maureen, known as Rennie. You can tell a lot about a man from his letters to his wife. And what you see in these letters, there's a kind of pathos to a lot of them. For one thing, he alternates between praising her. She's a very active Army wife. She lives in Washington, as so many of the generals' wives did during the war. And she is out raising money for war, selling war bonds to beat the band. She is one of the great sellers of war bonds in World War II. Millions and millions of dollars. So he's very proud of her for this. When she's out selling them in, Decatur or Dubuque or wherever, she tends to talk about her husband. All right, well, that makes sense. Well, she tends to brag on her husband. And this gets back to George Marshall, too. And Marshall sends word through Eisenhower, Mrs. Clark is talking too much about General Clark. And so he writes this. Actually, it's a series of scathing letters to her. I've told you before, you must not talk about me. She reads his letters to these crowds of people she's trying to... This doesn't go over well at George Marshall, believe me. And then on other occasions, he writes to her and he says his hair's falling out from the stress. And you can imagine the stress. 23,000 dead soldiers, It's amazing he had any hair. Look at Eisenhower. And he writes to her and he wants her to send a certain Kreml hair cream. And he said, I find if I massage it in, it prevents the hair from coming out in tufts. Well, this is poignant. Right? This is something that, it touches us. And so what you see in Clark is this somewhat tormented character in a very, very difficult job under the most arduous circumstances. My ambition from the beginning was to, I won't make you love him, but I will make you find him interesting. Sir?
Do you think the Germans could have had a better general than they did in Kesselring? He was pretty much a pretty great general on the other side, right?
Do I think that the Germans could have had a better general than Kesselring, who was indeed a very great field marshal? It's our great misfortune to face him in North Africa, and then again in Sicily, and then in Italy, and we will see him at the very end of the war in Western Europe, where it's too late for the Germans at that point. Yes, Albert Kesselring is a really interesting character. We've been talking about two great American generals. Kesselring is a better field marshal by far than anything the Americans have. He has come into the Wehrmacht as a young man, as an artilleryman. At the age of 40, he learns to fly and transfers to the Luftwaffe. Not the usual route for, certainly an American Army general. So he's actually a Luftwaffe general, and he's made a field marshal. He has the capability, we talked about some of Patton's attributes. Kesselring has what so many of the top German generals had, the ability to be deft, adroit, and utterly ruthless. When the invasion occurs at Sicily, it's a surprise, just as the invasion of North Africa has been a surprise. just as the invasion of mainland Italy turns out to be a surprise because they have very poor intelligence. He is not rocked back on his heels. He does, within hours, he has in mainland Italy, when the invasion occurs at Salerno, he is pulling units from all over the Mediterranean, not just from Italy down to the area south of Naples. He's pulling them from France. He's pulling them from the Adriatic. It's that kind of agility that Kesselring exhibits over and over again. Now, as an airman, and incidentally, he's shot down 5 times during the war. He flies in these little single-engine planes. He goes up and looks around, as many generals did, and because the Luftwaffe could provide him very little protection, he's shot down 5 times, including once in Italy. And he would come dragging into his command post, covered with mud, and they'd say, "Oh, the field marshal's landed in a lake again." What we see in both in Sicily and Italy is an ability to make do with very little. He's dealt a real bad weak hand in both Sicily and Italy. He's the one who organizes, certainly from a strategic standpoint, the strategy in Sicily, which is to kind of hold as best they can and retreat to the northeast to the Messina Straits so that all 40,000 of those German soldiers, almost to a man, get away with most of their stuff, and a whole lot of Italians get away with them. He is the one who persuades Hitler, and all this misery, these 312,000 casualties, fall on Kesselring's head to a large extent. He persuades Hitler, who, after the invasion at Salerno, is inclined to give up Italy. The Italians have switched sides. Why are you going to fight for Italy if they don't want to fight for themselves? And Kesselring, as an airman, knows very well that every kilometer closer to the Reich gives the Allies another kilometer of airfield. And that gives them B-24s, the whole panoply of American air power to bomb the fatherland. And so he persuades Hitler. Hitler changes his mind 180 degrees and agrees with Kesselring that they will fight all the way up the boot in a series of lines that he oversees, defensive lines, and makes life miserable. So it's a Kesselring strategy that we encounter there. He wasn't a real dedicated Nazi, but I wouldn't call him an anti-Nazi. After the war, they all... I mean, come on. Kesselring was tried after the war. He was convicted of mass murder. He was held responsible specifically for more than 300 Italian deaths. 300 Italians were murdered and in the Ardeatine caves outside of Rome in response for a partisan attack that killed 30-some German police officers, really, in Rome. The Germans, under Hitler's order, and Kesselring signed the order, rounded up Italians, took them out, and gave them a bullet in the back of the head. And he was tried, he was convicted, he was sentenced to death. And his sentence was commuted partly on the testimony of his Allied adversaries. For example, Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who was the senior Allied commander in Italy, he was Mark Clark's boss, and also a really fascinating character, wrote a letter of commendation for Kesselring afterwards, said this is fundamentally an honorable soldier, and he doesn't deserve to be hanged. He was not hanged. He was released from jail 5 or 6 years afterwards. All the time he was in custody, he wrote extensively for the Allies. When we had hundreds of German generals in jail after the war, and we encouraged them to write. And so we've got this huge compendium of accounts that German senior officers wrote. We did this partly because we wanted to know how they fought the Russians. We were looking very specifically for advice on how to fight the Russians. And so Kesselring wrote while he was in jail, and then when he got out of jail, he turned this into a memoir, quite a good memoir. All right, sir, take one back here. Yeah, you're it.
Getting back to Eisenhower and George Marshall,
George Marshall was made 5 stars also. There were, some of you will know, there were 6 of them, I think, 7. In the West Point superintendent's house, there's the 5-star room, and their portraits are around. I guess there's 7 of them. So Marshall was a 5-star. And Marshall, regardless of his rank, Marshall could have been, a lieutenant colonel, and he was clearly the boss. Eisenhower was, Marshall had a great commanding presence, and Eisenhower recognized it instantly. He was indebted to Marshall for all that Marshall had done for him. So he was a 5-star. Yes, ma'am. Monte Cassino. Yes, I did mention it. I left you hanging there saying that Abbey, somebody has to blow that place all to hell. I mentioned that there were a series of defensive lines that the Germans retreated to up the boot of Italy. Italy's fairly easy to defend. At the widest, it's only 100 miles or so across. It's very mountainous. The Germans were excellent at playing defense, particularly when they had the topography on their side. The Italian terrain helped them. The strongest of the defensive lines was built across the narrowest waist of the Italian peninsula, and it hinged on Monte Cassino. Now, the town of Cassino, which is about halfway between Rome and Naples, had been an ancient Roman town, but in the 6th century AD, it became a monastery, and it became one of the holiest places in Christendom. And by the time 1944 rolls around, you have this magnificent, if any of you have been there, it has been rebuilt after the war, and it looks much as it did in 1944. This magnificent, huge white structure on top of the mountain behind the town of Cassino, which is down in the valley, and it overlooks everything. And if you're coming north, going to Rome, and you've got a lot of tanks and you're a mechanized army, it's hard to get over those mountains with tanks. And so there's only really one way to go, and it's up the Liri Valley, which goes right along the base of Monte Cassino. The Americans and the British argued bitterly from December and into January 1944 about whether or not the Germans were using Monte Cassino as a lookout, whether or not they had occupied Monte Cassino. Now, the German, Kesselring, incidentally, was a good Catholic. He was Bavarian. He was not Prussian. There's no von Kesselring. He's not of German nobility. He was a good Catholic, and his corps commander there, General Friedland von Senger und Etterlin, was also a good Catholic. They very much heeded the Hitler decree that the Catholic Church was not to be offended. You don't want all those Catholics on your neck. And so Kesselring and Senger had agreed that the monastery would not be violated. Well, the Americans and the British and the New Zealanders and the Canadians, they're stuck there. And they're stuck there for week after week. And the monastery becomes the metaphor for this god-awful, stuck in the mud in the middle of winter, can't get to Rome feeling that they've got. The British in particular become persuaded, especially the corps commander, he's a New Zealander, in fact, Bernard Freyberg, becomes absolutely persuaded that the only way to move past this bottleneck is to flatten the monastery. This debate becomes very hot and heated in February of 1944. Freyberg and Clark says, "Don't bomb the monastery. It's not militarily significant. Don't do it." Almost all the Americans feel the same way. Freyberg wins out. He persuades General Alexander, the big boss in Italy, and so on February 15th, 1944, a massive bombing raid that goes on for several hours takes place. The monastery is obliterated. There are no Germans in it. That's quite clear historically. No Germans there. Germans were 200 yards away. Militarily, you don't want to be on the crest of the hill anyway. You want to be where you're better protected and so on. it was occupied by, no one's really sure, but probably 2,000 Italian refugees and a couple dozen monks, including the abbot. He was still there. No one knows, but several hundred were killed in the bombing. The monks were all in the deepest part of the cloister. They survived. The next morning, the abbot, his name is Demare, he was 78 years old, I think. He led a procession of survivors down the mountain. He's carrying a big crucifix down the mountain. The Germans pounce on it immediately as a propaganda coup. They've got this great footage of this spectacular monastery in ruins, smoke coming out of it. They take, this is General von Sanger, takes the abbot into the equivalent of CNN studio. He makes a videotape, or makes a movie at the time saying there were no Germans there. The Germans were observing the truce. It was a catastrophe from a public relations standpoint for the Allies, and it did them no good militarily. 1 month later, they're still stuck. They decide, okay, the monastery's gone, we'll flatten the town. So on March 15th, 1944, we did the same thing to the town, completely obliterated the town of Cassino. Just made it into better warren for fighting positions for the German paratroopers who were there. So Cassino is a very unhappy episode in what is really an unhappy campaign in Italy. Thank you. I think, is that it, Joe? Okay. He says we got to clear. Thank you very much. Thank you.